Hey there, welcome to this channel, or welcome back if you're already a subscriber. This video is all about sculpting the head, and I will be starting very much from the beginning with collecting reference, the kind of resources that I find really useful, then the skull, facial muscles, facial fat compartments, all the way to sculpting the small little pores and wrinkles in Zbrush. So a lot of the video will be time-lapse with me talking whenever I feel like there's something useful to add, and also display some graphics with that, so I really try to make it as informative and valuable as possible. Also in the description you can get some files. If you want to follow along, you can get the skull model. That will be my starting point. And so other than that, there's a facial muscle model that you can get also, and a PDF from my Gumroad. And that's pretty much it. I hope you have fun. If you have any comments or questions, you can always leave a comment. I try to get back to as many YouTube comments as possible, and you can also hit me up on ArtStation if you want, and then I'll reply there.
Alright, so the first resource you should consider getting if you haven't got it already is Pureref, which is a reference viewer that's 100% free. Basically, you can just drag and drop your images. You can have your window on overlay mode, so you can work in your 3D software and have it on top, staying on top, and just you can flip, rotate your images, you can group them, bunch them together, and then also add text and categorize them really. Okay, this one I expect most people know, very obvious, but in Google Images, if you go into Settings, Advanced Search, then you could specify your image size, and usually I find really the higher resolution is really for a lot of topics more useful, so I will go for something like 2 or more, often also 4, 6 and 8. There's not many images usually, but 4 can work if you go then Advanced Search. Because usually you can just set it to large, which is not that large really. Okay, Pinterest, all of you know Pinterest. I still want to include it because not everyone uses it, I guess. It has disadvantages I don't like. For example, you have oftentimes low resolution images. It takes a couple of more clicks sometimes to open an image than Google, but it's great for inspiration. Obviously, you get content suggested according to your previous searches, and then also the whole algorithm of Pinterest will favor more visually interesting results, so that makes it great for inspiration, especially. I usually prefer Google, but at times I check out Pinterest if I want to get some more some interesting visuals. Now we got our first anatomy reference here with Triplegangers. They offer 3D scans. You have a whole bunch, huge variety, 267 female, 248 male. It's mostly Asian, but you will find also Caucasian, African American scans. And the great thing is, if you pick any, you can see that you will have all these different facial expressions. I think it's the same every time. And if you click at one, or you select one, actually here, now you see you have the color information, which obviously is great for texturing, and then shaded. Good to see the shapes here, and yeah, makes it great for if you want to sculpt a facial expression. And yeah, just these images, you could get them for your Pureref or something, or you could buy one, I guess. Well, one tip that I would I think mention also is having a 3D scan next to your model just to check kind of can be super helpful, just to see some things look off or things you could implement. But yeah, Triplegangers is great. I go there frequently, and that's a nice one. Okay, next we have Zygotebody, which this one is more for general anatomy of the body. That's all. I mean, you could go into the head, the facial muscles also, but I still want to include it just because it's so awesome. You have all these layers you can disable, and then all these you don't need probably. And so if you're interested in a muscle, for example, you could go ahead and select, you could pin it, So now if you disable all these, that they still stay. Now you can see origin and insertion points. Unfortunately it doesn't say it, but I mean it's visible. You can yeah, at least get a good grasp. Okay, so 3D Scan Store, this one is fantastic as well. If I go here in the HD head models, this is where I got my reference for the tutorial from. The great thing about this category is you get a bit more close-ups and higher resolution images. You can see unique angles, they can be very, very helpful. These obviously from Zbrush are very useful. That was the best reference I really had. This kind of reference from Zbrush of real head scans is probably the best reference you will ever get. Makes it just so easy to understand the forms better than from real life photos. But yeah, they have a ton more. If you go here in the head scans, they have a bunch of categories. If we go into the shaded ones, cleaned, you can see for each you will get kind of the color information, which they can be cool too if you're on the texturing phase, and then you know the gray ones. They're not that high resolution, but decent. I mean, it's not that bad. Could be higher, but some close-ups too. So yeah, this one is great too. They have a bunch more stuff here. Now they added clothing a while ago, I think, and they have even ecochés. I mean, that can be pretty awesome too, you know. Although the Zbrush has the ecoché, the female ecoché by default, but yeah, they're really a great resource. Can't recommend it enough. Another site I want to quickly mention is Doctorlib.info. They have a bunch of anatomy stuff, also for the face and the head. There's also some text, but it's really for artists. So they have nice illustrations, I find. You can see they have some stuff here for facial expressions. I mean, in the context of the muscles. But yeah, they have great illustrations. That's good information. Also one of the better resources I've come across so far. Next we have Proko, and a lot of you will probably know his YouTube channel. It's for drawing, but obviously it applies perfectly fine to 3D. His website is just as good as his tutorials. I mean, his YouTube tutorials are amazing. But yeah, you can find everything here as well. Landmarks of the human body, how to draw the eye structure, for example. You can see here it's a lot of anatomy, great illustrations, simplified stuff, makes it easy to understand. Yeah, probably one of the best resources out there, along with his YouTube videos. So I'd highly recommend these resources too. Okay, next I have the website of artist Philippe Faraut. He's a traditional sculptor, and he has some art books that are also very well known. If you go on the online store, I got the Mastering Portraiture one. It's really fantastic. You got a lot of different ages, ethnicities, and all about the face. Many great examples. Very inspiring, the high quality, and he also goes into, he deconstructs how all the shapes are built up. So that's less focused on the the anatomy, all the bones and muscles. This really really a direct approach for artists that makes it great in addition to other studies. And it's also great to have some physical book. I don't know what it is about it, but yeah, that's great. I'm sure all these other books are just as good, I would imagine. So definitely check them out. Okay, next we got the drawing database, and this one again drawing, but I mean it's perfectly placed to 3D, and especially for the human figure, but also everything here, mouth anatomy, head and neck, and you can see he's really, I mean, unfortunately I don't know the name of the guy who's teaching it. He's teaching at university, and he's providing all these videos here on this YouTube channel. They're longer. You can see it's like 4 hours 18 for this one. So, but if you really want to dive deep, and I can really can't speak highly enough of this content also. Definitely check him out here. Ecochet Torso Lecture, that one was fantastic as well. I mean, this guy is really a master of his craft, I think. Okay, let's take a look at the bones of the head. Although I don't consider them that important, it's not that hard to learn, it's not that many. We have the frontal bone here, the forehead, the nasal bone, where the nose is obviously, zygomatic bone, maxilla, mandible, lacrimal bone here in the eye socket area, then sphenoid, parietal, temporal, and occipital bone at the backside. Much more interesting are the bony landmarks that I have here indicated in white. And the definition of a bony landmark is an area where there's not much space between skin and bone, or the skin is close to the bone, I guess. These areas, they help construct the face pretty much. So if we take a look here at the landmarks, and I'm going to display some pictures to illustrate that further, but here there's the temporal line. There are actually two lines, superior and inferior, I believe. But it's good enough to know there's the temporal line, and that's more visible in some people, especially if the lighting is white, like with any surface of the face. Then if we move on here on the forehead, we got the what's the name? Frontal eminences, and these are sort of two bumps, pretty much, and yeah, it's kind of good because a lot of times you see, especially with beginners, the forehead to completely flat looks kind of uninteresting and also not that realistic. I mean, usually you have at least some indication of that, and or the temporal line that helps bring a lot of shape to the whole forehead area. You can also divide the top forehead in planes, not working. One plane here, another then like this, another like this. I'm not sure if you can see it right. I mean, that's kind of hard to indicate like this, but I hope you get the point. I'm going to display some image anyway. So if we move on, here the zygomatic, this can be quite pronounced, especially females have these strong cheekbones, and then we have the here near the maxilla, that's not that I mean, it's kind of causing the shape, but it's not that strongly visible because there's a bit layer of muscle and fat, that's more muscle, I think, around this area that's covering that bone. But yeah, the chin bone, obviously, and then here the angle of the mandible, gonial angle also called, or this bone, I think, is the gonial, or no, this actually just this corner, I think. But yeah, that's the gonial angle for sure. And the angle of this also different in male and female. Usually male more, what's the name? More of a 90-degree angle. I'm not sure what the term is. And then female is a bit more angled, a bit more. What's the name again for that? No, I'm not quite sure, but you more than 90 degrees. That's what I'm trying to say. Not less. I wouldn't do it less. That wouldn't happen anyway. But yeah, so then we have a bony landmark here, but this is not that important, I think. Okay, if we move on to the nasal bone, that can also be quite visible, quite pronounced for some people. You can actually see where the bone ends, because there's this plane change in some noses. It's very extreme, and that's where this bone ends. Also, the way this bone ends, or the way the angle of this bone and the length also determines very much the shape of the nose, which is interesting. And then the shape of the cartilage Oh no, actually not the shape of the cartilage, but yeah, again the bone here at the bottom, again, and obviously the whole, there's a name for that whole opening too, but this whole area here around the nose determines very much the shape of the nose and then the cartilage. So that's why in facial reconstruction, scientists can really reconstruct a face, not only the nose, but similar to that, in other regions of the skull, they can really reconstruct how the face would look, which is, I think, quite interesting and very much emphasizes the point why this stuff is important. And so that's the nasal bone. Now, if we take a look here at the eyebrow area, we can see in the middle, that's the glabella. It's very subtle in women, and then in males it can be very pronounced, can be quite pronounced. There's some crazy examples where it's pushed to the extreme, but that's the glabella. And then very close to that here, that's the brow ridge. And that's again a very useful landmark to know, because this area here is very subtle. The plane changes here from the skin, but it's very important. See, if you don't consider these forms here, then this whole area will just be flat, which you see a lot of times. And having these subtle nuances here, where you have maybe this bumps transitioning into here towards the inside, along with the glabella here, and maybe the temporal line then coming in here, and the I keep forgetting this one. Frontal eminences, all these things coming together harmoniously, that's going to give you a nice looking forehead. Let's take a look at the difference between male and female skulls now. And this is something where you will sometimes see beginners' heads look a bit like the wrong gender, which by knowing these kind of points could be easily avoided and fixed. So if we now go over some of these bony landmarks, it's very much what we already discussed, but let's go over them quickly again. So glabella area here, we have more subtle in female skull. And this is a scan, by the way, I got from the 3D scan store, so this is more accurate than my model somewhat, but my model I worked fairly accurate, so it's a good model to use still, but this is more pronounced here. And from the male skull, the glabella, then we have the brow ridge, or also called superciliary arch here, this area, where we have it here more pronounced. Here we have the supraorbital margin. This is more sharp in females and a bit more dull in male skulls. And that's also a small detail, but not that small of a detail actually, that can be used really well in your sculpt. Then if we move on, obviously we have the here the cheekbone, the zygomatic bone, this more pronounced in women, and then the chin bone, it's a bit more rounded in females, and a bit more square in male skulls. The teeth, a bit larger in male skulls, and then we have again here this angle, gondial angle, and the word is obtuse. It's more obtuse in females, as you can see here in comparison, more of a 90-degree. Here it's a larger degree. And it's also, in males, it's more flared out, what you can see here. If I use the move tool, that's more flared out in males. And okay, there's one more point. That's the cranial mass. That's basically this whole area here. The whole mass of the cranium, so that's hence the name. And so in male skulls, we have that more pushed backwards. The whole thing is more pushed backwards. In females, you can see it's more straight up, and yeah, that's also a good one. And that's it for the differences in male and female skulls. Alright, let's take a very quick look at the aging of the skull, just in case you want to sculpt a younger or older face. There are some things we can quickly check on here. And we have here this newborn, 3-year-old, 6-year-old, adult, elderly. And if we look here at the newborn, what we can note is the nasal aperture, so this opening of the nose. The nose is relatively small. I mean, it's everything is obviously smaller, but yeah, it's the nose is noticeably smaller than the other features. For example, the eye socket doesn't grow the same weight here, and the shape pretty much stays consistent of the very much so, at least of the orbital here. And then what we can also see, the maxilla here, and these models are not perfect. You can see this kind of ugly. I just shaped these skulls as accurately as possible, considering time and everything. But yeah, the maxilla here, it protrudes in the young skulls, and then it kind of evens out in the adult skull, and then it recedes here in the elderly skulls, and it's a bit more shifted backwards, just as is the zygomatic bone shifted more backwards. And that also occurs on age, because with age comes bone resorption, and that's also noticeably in the chin, that gets shorter and also droops down. And yeah, while we have a lot of areas getting shorter and smaller with bone resorption, actually the forehead increases in size, so that's interesting to note. And then also interesting phenomenon is how you can see the skull starts very round, and then in the adult stage taking on a more square shape, and then with the later stages of life you have again come back to a more rounded shape. Let's take a look now at the differences of different races in the skulls. We have the European skull at the left, in the middle we have the Asian skull, and then the African skull on the right side. If you look at the shape, we can see the European and African skull are more broad and long, while we have the Asian skull a bit shorter and broader. Then if we go take a look at the orbit, we can see the European and African skull are very square, and the Asian skull not that noticeably, but it is more rounded, and so that's for the orbital. Then the nasal aperture, so the opening here, the complete shape here, open of the opening, that's for the European skull it's more narrow, and we can see the Asian skull has almost this hard shape, and the African skull has a very broad and wide nasal aperture, which results in the very wide noses that are noticeable for Africans. Then the nasal bone here, this small bone, that's also more it's more protruding, coming more out, and is more sharply angled for the European skull. And then the Asian skull, it's a bit less, and the African skull, which I think could maybe even isn't that pronounced here in the skull, it's more flat, definitely more flat. You can see very flat nose bridges in African faces sometimes. Now, if we take a look at the zygomatic bone, that's more pronounced, much more pronounced in Asian and African skulls, more forward sloping, and generally more pronounced to the side, laterally also. That's laterally or to the side. whatever you want to say. If you want to sound smart, you obviously say laterally. And then the teeth, we can see the European skull. It's relatively small compared to the African skull. Is more a bit larger, more spaced apart. And the Asian skull has these upper incisors shovel shaped, which is also characteristic. One more point, the chin is a bit elongated in European skulls, a bit more, come on, like this, not that much probably in most individuals. And that's not the case for the African and Asian skull. Alright, let's go over the facial muscles. I'm going to go over them very briefly because that's really a more important aspect for facial expressions, and that's really beyond the scope of this tutorial. And in a neutral expression, the facial muscles, you don't really need to know them individually, and they don't really contribute that much to the shape. Maybe if you have like a flexed jaw, then you can see the masseter muscle here. But yeah, let me go over them quite briefly for this tutorial. So here we have the forehead muscles in greenish. They're responsible for elevating and lowering the eyebrows, so they create wrinkles here, obviously for let's say a surprised expression. And then here we have the orbital muscles, obviously also moving the eyebrows and then closing the eyes, opening them, creating expressions where you have, you know, your eyelids pressed against each other, or you have them wide open, surprised or shocked or something. Then we have the nasal muscles. Nasal muscles, you know, lowering the tip of the nose and then lowering, widening the what's the name? The wing of the nose here. This, yeah, you know what I mean. The wing of the nose. Then we have the oral muscles, upper oral muscles here in green, elevating the upper lip. Then we have at the bottom here the lower oral muscles, lowering the lower lip. And then here in the middle, running around the lips, also moving the lips, contracting, yeah, moving the lips. And yeah, that's very rough, but I just want to go over that very quickly. So you can see, I mean, you get this also in the description, a link, you can get that for free, and you have all the names of these. Maybe it helps you visualize them. I mean, there's the Zygotebody that I showed earlier, the website. So, but if you like that, I mean, that can be cool. Maybe if you go into facial expressions, just as a study. And it also comes with the facial fat pads that I will go over in just a second. Also named, so yeah, if that's helpful, you can download that. And that's pretty much all I have to say about the facial muscles for this tutorial. Now let's take a look at the fat pads, and again, I won't spend much time talking about this because I mean, I could mention the names of these compartments, which would probably do nothing for you, and but you get the model. You can take a look at yourself, and you find these images. There's not that much on Fat Compartments, unfortunately. It's kind of hard to come by something high resolution anyway, but there is some stuff definitely, and but it's good to know, like, these compartments, they're always arranged in a certain way. And when you look at old people, because what happens is with old people, the fat compartments shrink, and that's when the skin gets loose and it gets saggy, and that's when certain shapes form. So even more, I mean, obviously for fat people you can make identify these, but it's kind of hard even with fat people, because it's all kind of merges into one big slope of fat, really. And but for old people, you can really see these individual compartments form, and so that's useful to know, I think. Yeah. yeah, you can identify these compartments if you look at reference, and having a couple of these references where you can see these compartments, that helps probably with sculpting old people and also fat people. So yeah, get the download. You get the download with the facial muscles, and I think that's it for the facial fats already. All this, if you want to find good reference for facial anatomy, facial fats, looking at plastic surgery advertisement and illustrations, that's also interestingly enough quite the reference. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the facial fats, and let's move on to the next chapter. Alright, so now we get started, and as you can see, I have a skull model here. The reason for that is, as opposed to a base mesh, which that's fine too, but for this topic, I think it's great because it very much guarantees us the correct proportions, because the skull model should be fairly accurate, and I really like that I don't have to import any image planes for measurements or do any manual measuring. That really lets me get straight into the sculpting. Very straightforward. I just go ahead, I add the sphere and start matching the shapes, kind of filling out the areas that I know will be filled out pretty much, and then I can start layering on top of that, kind of the way the muscle and the fat would lie on top. I really like this approach. As you can see, I started by performing a mirror and reeled operation on the skull, so it's in symmetry because I will work with the sphere and symmetry too. And after that, it's really matching it, like I said, and then after that I go and sculpt everything into kind of where everything is more or less recognizable as a face, and then I go switch between each facial feature, spend a bit more time, then go on to the next and kind of go rotate between them. So as you can see, I'm adding the eyes now, which I like to do that very early on. And the way I place the eyes is I create a sphere, and then I place it in the middle of the orbit. That's where it should be placed. Then if you go in the side view, you could draw a line from the zygomatic bone up to the supraorbital margin. If you draw a line there and then you make the eye touch that, that's giving you the correct position from the side view. Then there's one more thing, which is the size of the eyeball, and that's also quite easy to get right. All you have to do is, or all you have to know is, there's exactly one eye length in between the eyes. So you just can kind of copy the eye and then test out if it fits, and then adjust the size accordingly. And that's how you can get very quickly the correctly placed and measured eyes without doing any measurements really. So now I just keep refining everything, going from area to area and building it up slowly. The goal really here is to just get everything in a good spot where it looks pretty much like a face, and then um, once you know all the proportions and that stuff is figured out, then I start picking out areas and then going a bit further. So some of you will notice that I don't really use much reference here at all, and the reason for that is I've just sculpted a bunch of faces now, and I pretty much know how things should roughly look. And for these early stages, I'm just going by memory. But later on, I actually use a lot of reference. I'm a big believer in the more the reference, the better, and the higher quality, even better. So with the eyeballs in place, that's a great blueprint to just wrap the eyelids around, and it should be in a good place. But there are some things, some tips for the eyelids that I want to give you. Which the first one would be the thickness. That's the thing I see most commonly. Maybe the one thing that's wrong or unrealistic about head sculpts most often is very thin eyelids, and I've done that myself plenty of times when I was getting started. I'm not sure why it is, but that's one thing to keep in mind. What can happen is not only does it look unrealistic, just the bottom eyelid, and then but what happens is the upper eyelid is responsible for shadow. It, depending on the thickness, gives draws a shadow on the eye, And this shadow on the eye is very important to sell the realism or to get a realistic looking eye. So that's one point. Another point would be if you look at the curvature, you can see that the outer point or the outer part of the eyelid that's going towards the side of the head, that one reaches back a bit further and then it curves towards the inside of the face, and then towards the inside of the eye there's a plane change. So you can see how it doesn't continue going like on the outside going towards the back of the head, but instead it changes the direction and goes more towards the nose. One more point, the upper eyelid should protrude more than the lower eyelid, so it should stand out further. That's, as far as I know, always the case. So don't have it straight, completely straight, and even worse would be to have the lower eyelid come forward further, to protrude further than the upper eyelid. So that's just one more thing about the eyelids that's good to keep in mind. Okay, moving on to the lips area. First of all, we got this distinct curvature to the lips. They can be exaggerated if needed, maybe for stylization. Usually it's always visible in real life also, except maybe with age, as the lips lose their fullness, that's less pronounced. But yeah, this is always good to keep in mind. Then there's a small plane change just above the lips, and yeah, you kind of have this concave to convex going. So I think it's good, well visible, hopefully in the illustration I show. But yeah, there's this plane change. It's kind of small, but if you look out for it, you will mostly find it, and that's just another good detail to have to add, and that helps get you get you more realism in your sculpt. Then another one, the lips, if you want to visualize them with more simplified shapes, in terms of how the mass is distributed, you have two masses on the lower lips and one in the middle, central on the upper lip. And you could display that as maybe three spheres, and then usually the outside of the upper lips get a bit more flat, and on the lower lips, that's on the outside, there's more curvature there, more fullness, especially in women and in youthful lips. Because as people age, the lips lose their fullness, and then they kind of get smaller, almost disappear. Then there's another point which is similar to the eyes, or the eyelids, I should say. You have the upper lip slightly overlapping, slightly more protruding compared to the lower lip, and that's also important. If you neglect that or do even the opposite effect to that, that will give you probably a very undesirable look. Another element in the mouth area that's worth mentioning is the superior jowl fat compartment. That's one of these fat compartments that's a bit more noticeable, and especially in older people, as the fat volume decreases and the skin starts sagging down, you get this very characteristic look that you know and are familiar with. And but from younger age too, it's always you have this bump or this elevation, I guess, at the corner of the lips. Let's take a look at the nose now, and that can be a more challenging facial feature to get right. Here it really pays off to take a closer look at the anatomy of the nose, which it's not that terribly complex. There are a few parts. First, you have the nasal bone, which is the pretty much the upper part, and that then transitions into cartilage, lateral, and septal cartilage is a small strip on top in the middle, and then the main bulk on the front is the major alar cartilage, I guess. And that has a kind of a distinct shape. Taking a look at how it's shaped, it's really useful. I mean, noses come really in great variation, as do most facial features, but I think noses especially. And the shape of the cartilage, though, is very similar in most, probably in everyone has kind of the same structure. I would imagine. It makes sense, obviously, in different variations, but there are some planes to it, so it's not completely round. It's not like it doesn't have planes, and you can actually make out these planes. There's some planes on the side, there are like diagonal planes on the front, and yeah, just kind of getting familiar with this shape, I think helps getting a more realistic looking nose. And then you have the wings of the nose, which is consisting of fibrofatty tissue. That's pretty much everything concerning the anatomy. Another useful thing, or something just to keep in mind and to play with in your sculpt, is the nostrils. And here again, you have a lot of variation. You can take a look at some examples here. I'd just say not making them completely round. That's the most important thing. That looks quite unrealistic and uninteresting. I would say just when in doubt, just look for maybe a more unique shape. There are different shapes to go with, and but not completely round. That's what I would suggest. Now, if we take a look at the difference between a young person's and older person's nose, what we can observe is that in children we have these shorter, wider, and more concave and also slightly upwards pointing noses, not dissimilar to female nose. And then as the people get older, we get the longer, more narrow, and less concave noses, and then also even downward pointing, drooping nose, kind of this classical witch nose. And so that's just something also I guess that can be useful. And then if we look at male versus female, obviously we got in males the more pronounced, less concave. You get this pronounced dorsal hump, and then also it's not that common to have this upwards pointing as we can see in women and young children. And last but not least, we have nose shapes of different races, where we can see obviously African noses very wide and flat, also the nasal bridge, and then Asians as kind of an in-between between African and European, where European they have these narrow bridges and the noses are generally longer and more protruding also. Yeah, and Asian is kind of a mix between that. One more thing worth adding here regarding the nose would be asymmetry. And while obviously that's a good idea for the complete face, I think especially with noses that makes a lot of sense because we see that a lot. Not just the classical broken nose, like in kind of bent in one direction, but also more subtle things, and maybe the cartilage area, then the wings of the nose, or even the nostrils. Oftentimes, you will have the nostrils being asymmetrical. So these kind of things, they obviously I would wait until the pretty much to the end, or use a layer for that to be able to use symmetry still. But that's definitely one more thing where it really applies. One more angle that's worth looking at for the nose is from below, where you can see the way the philtrum or the area around the philtrum transitions then into the nose. That's giving you some good information. Also the whole profile from the philtrum and surrounding mouth area, because where the philtrum is, it's kind of bulging out. I don't know how to describe it better, but there's this plane change. I will try to illustrate it, and that's one last thing I would say that's very useful. Obviously, there are a bunch more angles, and that's a point I made earlier, I think, in the video, where I was saying that having a lot of angles, also unusual angles, and in addition to that, unique lighting scenarios that help kind of uncover or display, highlight, showcase. That's enough synonyms, I think. Different areas of any feature, and that helps just get some more information and just bring it up a little bit in terms of quality and realism. So as you can see, I'm sculpting the neck muscles now, which I'm not going to talk about them a whole lot because I try to make this video really about the head. But of course, it's essential to have the neck muscles in place somewhat, so in your final image you don't have the face floating around in space, or um, maybe you can cover it with a helmet or something clever. But anyway, so really there's one very visible muscle on the side of the neck, which is the Sternocleidomastoid. It originates in the manubrium, which is the upper part of the sternum, and then also the medial portion of the clavicle, and it then inserts in the mastoid process. And as it's very visible, that's behind the ear, this bony protrusion, and that's really all I'm gonna say about this, the neck muscles. Obviously, there's also the trapezius and some more smaller muscles, but um, that's pretty much it for this video. All right, let's take a look at the ears now, and I think ears are more straightforward part. There's not a whole lot you can do wrong, although there are some things to take into consideration. So in terms of how it's built, there are some parts. Obviously, you have the typical helix, anti-helix shape, and then also the tragus, which is the small bump sticking out towards the side, and then also you got the lobule, the meaty part at the bottom, and then on top of that, or at the top of the structure, you have the anti-tragus. And the only thing really to be aware of is that usually the ears are the part of the body where you see the most subsurface scattering when the lighting is playing into that. And especially the anti-helix needs to have the right thickness, and I don't even think I really nailed it or paid much attention to it here in my sculpt, but I'd advise you to do that and make it quite thin. Then there's one mistake I used to make, which is having the ears more or less straight, and that's usually not the case at all. You will find that most people, to a lesser or greater extent, you have the ears tilted backwards, and this is also, I think, good to know, good to push to some extent. Doesn't have to be super exaggerated, or it can be, but I say in general, completely straight is also a bit more boring. For that reason, that's even more important, maybe. One more thing I would add is taking advantage of choosing an interesting silhouette. There's really a astonishing, I guess that's a bit of an exaggeration. There's an interesting variety of silhouettes and shapes in the ear, and yeah, if you look at this reference I have here, you can maybe I mean, I guess there's no generic shape that looks that bad. I guess it's a small detail, but that can be, on the other hand, if that's used properly, you can definitely make it look more interesting, instead of maybe a completely generic looking ear. Especially if you have a character that's in general not that generic looking, you want the ears to probably match that. Then there's some other options. There's these very elongated earlobes in some African cultures or tribes, and then maybe also the cauliflower ear, which is these puffed up kind of trauma from direct hits for fighters or wrestlers, and um, or fighters in general, I guess, and that could be also something interesting. So yeah, that's one more way to add maybe to the interest and make it a bit more, add a bit more story to it, I guess. So as you can see, I'm using mostly clay builder brush and then some damp standard mixed in there sometimes. And that's pretty much it. I'm just looking at the reference, trying to build up the form slowly, and everything that I'm doing here is based on what was already covered before that, where I talked about, you know, facial fat, the skull mostly is what's important here, and then some of the planes, I guess, planes of the face, and some of the shape breakup. And yeah, maybe I can talk a bit about why I picked this reference. And I mean, I almost went for a likeness here. I never went for a complete likeness because I feel like that's just such a time sink. And like 80% or 90% likeness is so much faster than when you try to get these last percent. And so, but I like the reference. I like this guy's face had some interesting shapes, and the great thing about this reference, which haven't found a reference like that, is, I mean, there's some nice, fairly high resolution shots from Zbrush, but there's also some guy that's associated with 3D Scan Store, who has a blog, or it's 3D Scan Store's blog, but he made a post of this guy 3D printed, and there's some really high resolution images too. And in the printed, the print is insane, by the way. Like, I've never seen such a good print. So I guess I'll have to link that also. I guess I'm gonna display some images here. but yeah, you could see crazy detail, even more, even pretty much the same, or sometimes you could see it better on this printed thing, but I guess the figure was quite large too. One thing that you can't see in this video, but a point that I would recommend is bringing your model into another 3D software to do some test renders. Maybe not at the earlier stages, but not too late maybe. Or actually whenever you feel stuck, or at least I like to do that when I'm kind of out of the flow, then I use it, I export it, because the great thing is not only can you start kind of streamlining everything, testing out the shader and stuff, and working towards the final image, but it's mainly kind of a change of perspective, similar to, if I'm not sure if you're aware of this trick where you flip the image horizontally. That kind of works in a similar way. Um, Both work great, but yeah, looking at it in a different camera with different lighting, that definitely helps see it with new eyes, and that kind of helps, keeping it on track, because sometimes I think it's probably the same with everyone. Looking at something for very long, for kind of extended periods of time, you get used to it. You kind of um, get a bit attached in a way that you can't really judge it very objectively. And so that's a great way to just get a reality check, I guess. Sometimes a harsh reality check also. But yeah, I mean, um, yeah, that's what I like to do, and that's what I don't record it, the process of putting it in Maya, but that's something I would recommend whenever I mean, you're on the flow, and then you can sculpt ahead, but then at least when you're kind of stopping or something, then that's a good opportunity, I think, to bring it in a different perspective and double check. I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but what I always do, or at least I try to do, and I hope you see me doing frequently, is look at it from more angles than just the front, the side. Maybe also from, at some point, you should definitely look at it from the top, from below a bit. And this habit of kind of rotating around, I think, serves you well, and getting it realistic. Another one would be to also not spend too long in one area, but kind of just switch around between parts. And as soon as you feel like you're spinning your wheels, not doing anything, keep it going. So another thing that's maybe even more important than looking from different angles is looking from far away. Um, some people, me included, have the tendency to, you start working on details, and then you get into it and kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. And that happens if you don't once in a while zoom out. That's obviously also the trick with using another camera and flipping horizontally, but um, then that's kind of a similar thing, just zooming out and looking at it from afar, because unless you got that strong foundation, the silhouette, the primary shapes looking right, then all the detailing in the world really doesn't make it any better. As you can see, I'm just Zremeshing it now, and I could have done that a bit earlier. Usually I like to stay in Dynamesh for a bit because I feel like then I'm less tempted to commit to something too early. So while I'm still figuring out the larger forms, I don't want to screw up the topology. I mean, Zremeshing is quick, so you can always re-Zremesh if you want, but usually even when for this I'm not trying to get it animation or game ready. Perfect topology still. The topology has to be somewhat good so you can sculpt nicely, because if the edge flow is completely awful, that's just a very, very horrible sculpting experience. What you can see here is that I try to push in where the eyelid kind of gets overlapped, the upper eyelid with the skin. And sometimes people don't really do that. They just sculpt it in a bit and indicate it, but that really doesn't work too well mostly. So yeah, I would recommend really pushing it in quite far, so you really have that overlapping effect. And that works well if you have good topology and you have just one edge loop that you can mask with a Z modeler, and then you can invert and push in these vertices. Here I have to do it a bit more manually and messy, even with sculpting brushes then, but at the end it worked out alright. Really, at the end, faster than going ahead and trying to create good topology. So as you can see, I'm adding smaller wrinkle lines and creases now, and it seems like a small detail at that stage, but since I have subdivisions I can switch back and forth easily anyway, and I usually like that workflow, and I know from a couple of other people that do the same, to go ahead after you've done your main sculpt with the primary shapes and maybe some secondary shapes, and then you go into some of the surfacing before doing all the secondary shapes and also tertiary shapes. I'm not sure what's the definition there, but I think that doesn't count to the surface detail as well. But the thing is, once you have all this finer detail, that kind of helps, especially creases and wrinkles. They kind of give it some directionality that makes any sense. And from there, you can more easily build up these secondary shapes accordingly. So I see it as these working together, and I find doing it in this order I found it to be a nice workflow with good results. So that's how I approach it here. You can see on this image from the PDF there are names to all these creases, and they're always in the same pattern, obviously with variation to it, but it's more or less the same. And not just for very old people. I mean, most of these start forming mid-age, and I thought this could be a really useful graphic to just, you know, keep this in mind. Maybe when sculpting a mid-aged person, then the reference images you have don't necessarily display all that very clearly, depending on, you know, the kind of reference. But then adding some of the stuff more subtly, and then it gets reduced by subsurface scattering and stuff anyway, and that maybe can help even add a bit of more interest and make it more realistic, because realism really, once you have the primary shapes in place, a lot of what adds to realism is attention to detail, and obviously uh, doing the detail in a realistic manner, how it occurs in nature. And of course, there's this phenomenon that with faces, since evolutionary, we were kind of we depended on having a great ability to read faces and to you know, understand if we have an enemy or a friend in front of us. That kind of makes it very easy to spot things that look off, and that doesn't just apply to the bigger shapes, but also I believe, you know, when it gets into the skin surface, obviously depending on the resolution you want to display in your final image, um, which I'm not a big fan of showing these super close-up shots, because I find what it takes to get that to look realistic is just a bit nutty, and quite frankly, I don't really have the patience. On top of that, what I think talked about earlier, I don't want to get into that again, is, you know, just the ability of some software to create realistic skin. So, but what I'm more interested in is these secondary shapes, and this breakup of the wrinkles and lines that just helps kind of guide that process of building up these secondary shapes. And then there's obviously still some surfacing with alphas that I use, and maybe also some manual pores in some places that's more prominent. But yeah, the point being, I hope this graphic is helpful. When I came across these names, I thought that's really interesting, and all the stuff, all these information you will find on plastic surgery, yeah, mostly plastic surgery sites, that they really start giving it name to, I guess, inform people about where they're gonna make some cuts and chop away and add maybe some whatever material, or what you call it, filler, I guess. And so, but yeah, that these are great resources. So you can really find names for a lot of stuff on the face, and I guess especially as a beginner, that can be very useful, because once you have a name, then it makes it easier, because looking at reference, obviously you just gonna get a feeling for it over time, looking at stuff all over and over again and seeing patterns. But I guess getting a name with it just makes it a bit faster to just absorb the information. So since the mouth here is closed with my model, I figured alphas do not work very well, and projection I didn't want to do anyway for this project. So because the lips aren't that terribly complex, there's a bunch of lines, but I figured I just sculpted in here. Nothing against alphas, obviously great time saver, but I think it's even better if you have an open mouth and you can maybe adjust it a bit so that you can apply it correctly. I mean, obviously you could have done that here a bit too, but in the final images it didn't show super negatively. The lips looked alright, so yeah, this whole project was more about the secondary shapes and trying to get it to look realistic from further away, and for that I think sculpting works well. And but obviously there are some great alphas for lips that usually I use some alphas, but yeah, that's what I did for this project. So I kept the subdivision level at 6 here for this project with just 11 million polygons, and prior to that my project I've always subdivided once more and ended up around 30, well maybe 25 to 35 million. And this one level is really what makes all the difference then, where it really gets slower when you do the undos, especially. That's super annoying, I find. Then the quick save obviously, and then when you add layers, that's when it gets really bad. I also try to minimize the layer use here. I mean, obviously layers are great, especially when you work in a production. Then you want to be able to change everything according to feedback. And obviously in personal projects you also want to be flexible, but then I also like to have it run very smoothly and have good performance. That just makes the experience a lot better. And I found with 11 million that was much more fun. I was actually surprised at how the final images came out. I mean, I didn't do like extreme close-ups, but the resolution is fairly high and it works quite well, in my opinion. Um, Obviously, with texturing XYZ, when you get the tertiary detail and the what's not the tertiary detail, the blue channel with the finest detail, the micro detail, of course, that's a different level. Although, this kind of stuff you could also add in the shading network in Maya without having to add it to the polygons in Zbrush. But I like it this way. I'm kind of I mean, I think it's super cool if you can nail that very close-up shots that looks badass, and I appreciate seeing these types of renders, but personally for me, I don't find it very engaging to do this kind of work. So when I get the realism from fairly close, then I'm super happy with that, and that was the case here. And so yeah, even though also had the neck area, I mean there was a fairly large area with the neck also, the head, that this worked with 11 million was cool to see, because yeah, like I said, it was pretty smooth.
By the way, if you like some of these graphics and illustrations that are displayed, you can check in the description. I put a link. It's part of an ebook that I created. It's 85 pages, nothing crazy, but I put in quite a bit of effort, so it's very much the same content as the video, obviously the same content, but a couple of slides more. And the real benefit, I think, is just how convenient it is. Personally, I really like having something in text form, because while I work I can just check super quickly. Looking up a video, that's something I probably wouldn't consider in most cases when I'm just working on something. But yeah, I think you'll like it, and if you do and you got it, then I'd really appreciate if you leave a review on Gumroad. Also, I have a 50% off, so that comes out around $5, which I think is affordable for what you get anyway. Yeah, just want to throw that out there in case anyone happens to be interested.
So at this point I'm starting to create the UVs by creating groups. The groups are basically the same as if you were to cut edges in your 3D software, and it's helping the UV master, create these shells, and um, by doing that you avoid running into issues that can usually happen where, either it doesn't work at all or you get stretched areas, overlaps sometimes. I find that happens a lot depending on the complexity of your model if you don't create groups to help it out. Just make sure to enable the groups field, so when it runs the unwrap, then it actually considers these groups. And I'm doing the UVs at this point because I want to apply some tileable textures with the Noisemaker. And you can also do this with a 3D space, but most of the time you get these very stretchy areas. In some space it works well, and in others it doesn't work at all. And so I'm using the UVs for that. I need UVs anyway, and the UVs are, obviously far from perfect, but similar to the topology, it does not really matter for this kind of project, centered around, sculpting the human head, and so. But yeah, that's how I create the UVs at this point and continue with some skin detail. Here I start applying some basic pore texture. It has some nice surface detail to it, so it's not just strong pores, but I find it works well to apply overall and serve as a good ground base to then build on. So you have some pores, but it's not like they jump out like crazy, because obviously when you look at reference, usually there are some areas where you have the pores more defined, around the cheeks maybe, and then a bit also in the between the eyebrows and the top of the nose. But it's not that noticeably, and I like to do these kind of strong pores more manually or enhance what I have. But overall, sometimes I see this with beginners where you have this kind of stronger pores all over the face, which just looks unrealistic. It doesn't really happen. Another one that I see is not having the right spacing between pores. I think what I have here is fairly accurate, but sometimes you see the pores spaced apart very far, or have them too close even. And that's obviously also something that you wouldn't see in real life. So I try to get the spacing right and then go from there. So what you could see me do is, before I applied the surface noise, I stored a morph target, and then I could after that use the morph brush to get rid of some of the noise that I didn't want. For example, the eye area, there's no pores there. It's a different kind of a smaller, finer detail, but not pores really. And the morph target is really fantastic for all the surfacing work, because with the morph brush and also the morph slider, you have a lot of control to, adjust the intensity and also work more locally. I prefer the morph target over the layer system, which, with the layer system you could also obviously adjust the intensity, and the morph target and the layer system work great together. But as I think stated earlier, I don't really like using too many layers because it slows everything down. Changing the layer intensity alone, usually I find it not as responsive as the morph slider. So the nose is another area where there are less pores. It tends to be a bit smoother, and there are some pores and also some blackheads, pimples and that stuff, but it's a bit more spaced apart compared to, let's say, the cheek area. And so what I'm doing now is just adding a couple of layers and trying to build up the skin. I'm not too worried about what now looks to be very uniform and a lot of pores everywhere, but it's quite subtle, and as you would see later on in the test renders, it's really not showing and coming through that much. but it's breaking up the specularity. I guess that's what it's mostly for. And obviously I'm also enhancing some areas of the pores later on. At this resolution, what's great about it also is there's I don't know if I wanted to call it a technique. It's just, yeah, I guess a technique that I at some point started using is when I find there's some skin surfacing that's too intense and it's kind of looking off and when rendering it, then an easy way to get rid of that is use the clay builder brush and go over it, alternating between adding and subtracting. And what it does is usually it just evens out and it fills out the it evens out the skin. So obviously the smooth brush is not a great solution to get rid of that, because then what happens is you get these really muddy kind of results. So here I'm adding a larger scale pour to the cheek area, and that's really the whole beauty of the morph brush and morph target, allowing you to kind of control where you want the surface noise to be applied. Because then you get kind of the best of both worlds, where you get the efficiency and the speed of tileable textures, and then also but a bit more control of doing the manual applying to where it actually fits. So I'm using some of Pablo Munoz's brushes here. You can get this skin pack from him on his website Zbrush.com. And also another tip, if you're like me and your brush menu is completely stacked, then you can create folders for the lightbox and store some of the brushes there also. But yeah, I'm using some of his brushes now. I really like the horizontal wrinkle brush, for example. And then I go over some areas and start kind of building up some detail. So I'm adding a layer now for asymmetry, and at this point I feel like I've done a lot of work in symmetry, and it holds up fairly well, but um, having the asymmetry on a layer, obviously you can always go back and disable it and work again in symmetry, and correct some things, maybe in proportions. But so when to break asymmetry is the big question, and I think there's no perfect answer. Some people like to break it earlier, and there's good reasons for that. That's usually then resulting in a more asymmetrical and maybe more interesting sculpt, arguably, and but then it's taking more time, obviously, to work both sides individually. So I try to. Especially what you want to do is get most of the surfacing done, because there you won't really see any difference anyway, because it's so small and it's just affecting the specularity, which since the light is not hitting in symmetry, that won't be noticeable. Asymmetry is really an important step, obviously. I feel like that's when the sculpt really comes to life in a way, because um, in symmetrical sculpt looks just kind of boring and not believable anyway. And so some of the first things I do will be, to adjust the eye height. So you have, usually with most people, there's some degree of difference in the height of the eyes, or the position, the vertical position, I guess. And then the nose could be shifted a bit. Um, Not just the nasal bridge, but also on the nose bridge. I don't know if nasal bridge is a word. But then also the wings of the nose. Usually the nostrils have asymmetrical shape that gives it some more interesting look right away. And then, I mean, you can obviously apply that all over the face, so there's no limit really to where you can do it. The corners of the mouth, that they have different heights, maybe, and so on. Then all the smaller stuff, how the wrinkles, bigger wrinkles, obviously, makes sense to do them differently. The eyelids, I will adjust as the process goes on, and all this stuff. I mean, yeah, you should definitely spend a lot of time doing that. Okay, so there's one point I want to make about the profile or fall-off of crease lines and wrinkles. It's a bit hard to put into words, so I hope you understand it from the images anyway. But what I'm referring to is what happens with where the skin meets, or where the wrinkles and crease lines are created. The fall-off looks in a lot of places, and at least a lot of reference I've seen, most of the time it's a very smooth fall off, but then they meet in a sharp transition, and that's sometimes I see sculpts where, depending on what brush was used, that looks not really there, and then what can happen is that some wrinkles look too intense, and this technique, or trying to emulate this transition from real world reference, can help get more natural looking transitions. That's the experience I had. I hope that makes any sense, and um, maybe that's a small detail, but kind of this fall off is something that I found was one of the bigger improvements that I saw when I implemented that. Um, where before I didn't pay much attention to the fall off, and sometimes I think the fall off was just off and reflected in a um, odd looking result. A quick tip for the transition between nose and the eyebrow forehead area. If you look at some scans or photos, you can see that's one of the areas where the pores are a bit more noticeable, I find. And if you want to make it very realistic, what you would want to do is block out some of these pores, maybe even with some manual drag ragged or some alpha, and then you can combine these pores with a damp standard, and create these wrinkles. That's kind of what happens in real life. Um, and I'm not doing it right now, but that's I think what I do at some point, hopefully. Um, but but yeah, I thought I mentioned it at this point because that's one of those areas, just another opportunity to build in some realistic detail. So for the forehead area, what you can see on some reference here is there are some smaller to mid-sized pores, and then you also have, depending on the reference and I guess on the individual, you have this really typical leather-like structured skin also. And then obviously you have a lot of wrinkles and skin creases, also these tiny ones. What I did here is I tried to add a lot of those very small ones. It turned out in the renders in Maya, I didn't really like it too much. It didn't look very realistic. I think I prefer to have like a bit of a softer skin. I think it was a bit too irregular in general, too bumpy, I guess. And so later on, I think I merged that back with this clay build-up technique and kind of getting rid of some of these smaller horizontal wrinkles too. Um, Although, that's what you sometimes see on these photos, but I think it's more subtle than what I did here. So, yeah, I wouldn't recommend trying that, or maybe try and see, depending on, how it looks in your shader, then maybe it works, but yeah, just throwing that out there. If you take a look at reference of the eye bag and eyelid area, then there are like two different type of detail that you see. Oftentimes a mix between those, but there's for one, you have this bumpy skin with like small bumps, almost like the goosebump skin. And the other one is very fine, long lines, and yeah, sometimes both. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm thinking about what brush. I mean, there are many brushes that work since it's just normal small bumps. And I think with manual sculpting, which I did here, you can get good results too. Maybe you can have some alpha and that would work even better. Alright, so here I'm breaking up the nose with a dorsal hump. I think it's a good way to just have some breakup of silhouette, I guess, in the nose bridge. And then after that I apply some basic noise, which I find that the basic noise can work fairly well to just give the skin some variation and some irregularities. So, and for that I find you could do that on either a larger scale, so you have like bigger scale variations, then mid frequency, obviously something like similar to pores maybe, but then obviously you keep that, for all these you keep that fairly subtle probably. And or you can even do that with a very high frequency, and that would maybe be something to just break up the specularity. So now I'm combining some of the pores with a damn standard brush, and I do that in some places. It gives it some directionality, and yeah, it can be used in with wrinkles. I think usually these breaks occur along the pores, so but yeah, that's one thing I do, and then I also use the standard brush with a drag rect and some alpha, I think alpha 6 or so, something with a fairly smooth fall off, and that's just giving some bumps and here and there, and adding all these smaller imperfections, then maybe some smaller scars that you have. I mean, there's some smaller scarring too, I think, when you have had a pimple or something, or I guess some heavier acne. All this kind of skin damage that occurs because at least for people that are a bit older and exposed to the sun and everything, and who have maybe been through some stuff, some fights or whatever, they it usually shows in the skin, and it breaks this perfect look. And something too perfect in CG is always destroying the realism a lot of times. Unless you have trend in mid-20s model, then maybe use that more sparse. But I like to do that kind of smaller detail. So one thing that I really like doing once I got all these smaller wrinkles and crease lines in place is use either the standard brush or the elastic brush to then go over these forms that you basically separated by some lines, and then build them up so they have a fall off. And um, so basically the standard and elastic brush preserve the form and the detail, and so you don't have to worry about destroying the finer detail or filling out pores or something, because that will not happen with these brushes, as opposed to the clay builder brush, for example. And usually I put them on a fairly low intensity. I think elastic brush around 30 and standard brush maybe 12 to 15. And yeah, then I go over some places. Okay, here's a detail that's maybe very minor, but I still like mentioning it because I really like this one. Um, the Sternocleidomastoid has these two heads, one attaching more in the middle at the manupium of the sternum, and then one that's on the clavicle. And the one at the clavicle is more subtle, and but you can see it, and it kind of crosses and meets with the other head, and so that's just giving you this breakup, because otherwise I feel like the whole neck area would look like a bit like a cylinder would be just stuck into, you know, the rib cage, I guess. And so this way you have this diagonal line kind of breaking it up a bit, and you know, in some reference you see this. I'm not quite sure right now, but I think the reference that I have it shows there too. But yeah, that's one thing, you know. It doesn't have to be very pronounced. In fact, I think probably it shouldn't be if the head is not turned and it's not engaged. But to indicate that, I feel like that's one of those things too that's maybe worth considering. So here again, using the standard brush to build up some of the forms and break up the shapes, especially on the forehead and side of head. It's important, obviously, because it's a bit more tricky. Because, for example, on the cheekbone, you kind of know, or the chin, or wherever, you know, sort of the anatomy, and it's a bit more obvious how you can break up these shapes. But then the forehead, there's no clear blueprint, you know. You can look at reference, and it's always a bit different from reference to reference. So that's why I keep it subtle, but I try to look at reference and copy some elements, and then just try to basically break it up and introduce some noise, some very subtle noise. So at the end, it just doesn't look too flat in the final image, and so that's what I try to do, at least. I'm also adding a vein here to the side of the head. That's another detail that I find makes not a big difference, but it's one of those details that definitely matter in the end result. So I try to make it fairly subtle, but hopefully visible in the final image.